Tonight at 10, the unfolding catastrophe in Afghanistan, where a shortage of food and aid is causing terrible suffering. The United Nations says the situation is fast becoming the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. We report on the families forced to take desperate measures, including selling their babies to buy food.
Another person came up to one of our team and asked if we'd like to buy their child. The desperation and the urgency of this situation is hard to put in words.
The situation in Afghanistan has become markedly worse in the 2 months since the Taliban seized power. Also tonight, millions of workers stand to benefit from a rise in the national living wage to £9.50 an hour. We report from Burnley on the efforts to deal with the increase in mental health issues in the wake of the pandemic. And the UN warns that greenhouse gases are at record levels just days before the climate change conference in Glasgow.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News channel. Sobering scenes for Scotland, thrashed by Afghanistan in their first Super 12 match at the Men's T20 World Cup.
Good evening. We start with the terrible plight of millions of people in Afghanistan, where a deadly combination of a lack of food and a shortage of international funding is threatening to create the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. The United Nations says the country, where the Taliban seized power 2 months ago, is heading for catastrophe. The UN estimates that around 23 million people, over half the Afghan population, face an acute shortage of food. That is a rise of nearly 40% since April this year. And international aid, which has been keeping the economy afloat, has all but dried up as world leaders consider their approach to the Taliban regime. As the BBC's Yogita Limai reports, some families have reached the point where they're selling their children to make ends meet. A report from the western city of Herat contains distressing detail from the start.
This is what starvation does to a country, to its tiniest lives. 6-month-old Usman, Habibur Rahman, born 3 months ago. Afghanistan was barely surviving before the Taliban took over. But now, foreign funds which propped up this country have been frozen, putting at least 1 million children at risk of dying. In this ward, 1 in 5 will not make it. Usman weighs less than half of what he should. His father among millions who have no work. Usman's mother told us his twin is in a room next door. This hospital is full. Some babies are already sharing a bed. While we were there, 6 more children were brought in. It's the only facility for hundreds of miles. Because without foreign money, most hospitals are collapsing. Doctors and nurses, among masses of government workers who haven't been paid for months. 1/3 of the country's people don't know where their next meal will come from. We travelled out of Herat to a rural settlement. Tens of thousands displaced from remote provinces by decades of war and severe drought. No means of income, barely any food. Some days, families here don't eat. They've sold whatever little they had. And now, some are forced to do the unthinkable. This baby girl has been sold by her family. We're hiding their identity to protect them. Her husband used to collect rubbish, but even that earns him nothing now. Once the baby is able to walk, she'll be taken away by the man who bought her. He's paid more than half of the £400 she's been sold for. That'll get the family through a few months. They've been told the girl will be married to his child, but no one can be sure. We know there are other families here who've sold their children, and even while we've been here, another person came up to one of our team and asked if we'd like to buy their child. The desperation and the urgency of this situation is hard to put in words. There is no more time left to reach the people of Afghanistan. It cannot wait while the world debates whether or not to recognize a Taliban government. Nearby, aid agencies hand out parcels that might save some children from hunger. Alone, they can't provide for the staggering needs. Giving the Taliban money without guarantees on human rights and how the funds will be used is dangerous. But Afghanistan is sinking fast. Millions here will not survive the winter. Yogita Lamai, BBC News, Herat.
In Kabul tonight is our Afghanistan correspondent, Sikandar Kamani. Sikandar, when we look at these horrific problems that we've been reporting on tonight, what will it take for the Taliban to be able to attract back some of the funding and the aid that it's lost in recent months?
Well, look, Huw, some humanitarian aid is still continuing into Afghanistan, but given the sheer scale of the crisis right now, it's simply not enough. But Afghanistan's economy, including the vast majority of public spending, that's on things like healthcare, teachers' salaries, all of that was deeply dependent on international funding. And that's what stopped. At the same time, $9 billion of Afghanistan's foreign reserves were frozen by the United States. So there's a real shortage of cash here, and that's what's driven this crisis. Western diplomats, however, they have deep concerns about the Taliban, about their willingness to crack down on groups like Al-Qaeda, for example, about their treatment of women and young girls. The Taliban want international legitimacy, they say. They want international assistance, but it's not clear what they're willing to compromise on to get it. Time to find a solution to this, though, is running out.
Sikandar, many thanks again. Sikandar Kamani, our correspondent there in Kabul. On Wednesday, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak will unveil his budget at Westminster, which will include an increase in the national living wage. The current rate, which applies to workers aged 23 and over, is £8.91 an hour. Mr Sunak will announce that the new rate will be £9.50 an hour, and that represents an increase of 6.6%, which is around double the rate of inflation. The change will affect millions of low-paid workers, but Labour is saying that much of the increase will be swallowed up by various tax rises and cuts to universal credit. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has more details.
Behind the Treasury's closed doors, the budget plans are being drawn up. But while the official announcement's still days away, details of spending plans have started to emerge. Today, news of a wage rise for some of the lowest paid.
Cost of living is a really important issue. The key thing is that today's announcement, an extra £1,000 a year for people on the national living wage, is a really important protection against those pressures, and it helps to make sure that every family in the country where people are in work can really see that this is a government that's on their side.
People working in retail or hospitality, care or maintenance are among those who will likely benefit. Those aged 23 and over will see wages rise to £9.50 an hour from April, with increases for younger workers too, welcomed by some in Birmingham today.
It's good news for everyone, really, especially people that works in care works and cleaning jobs and things like that.
Well, it's a shame it's not more, but it is going to help, yeah.
I think it's good, to be honest, because
with that money adding up, it's going to do a lot for a lot of people. Minimum wage has to always increase, to be honest.
But for Hetty, who runs a brownie business in Gloucester that we visited at the start of the pandemic, it's an extra challenge after a tough time and could mean costs are passed on to customers.
It will mean that we'll have to increase our product prices, and it does make it difficult for when I want to reward my team for their hard work by giving them pay rises, and it still feels like a pay rise for something great they've done rather than because the government's told me I have to.
With the economy moving again after COVID, there has been pressure on the government to help those struggling with rising bills and rising prices. Part of its answer is pay going up. The government says it wants to move to a high-wage economy where people earn more to help with household budgets. As well as today's announcement, the Chancellor's hinted that public sector workers could be in line for a pay rise too. But critics say it isn't enough, given that some support put in place through the pandemic has ended and people are facing tax rises too.
What the government have announced today is going to be swallowed up by the tax rises they've already announced, by that big cut to universal credit, and because people are already seeing big increases in the cost of living. So it's just more smoke and mirrors for the government.
There will be more to come from the Treasury on Wednesday, when the Chancellor will set out not just who might benefit from this budget, but how he plans to keep the books balanced. Well, we've had a flurry of announcements ahead of the budget, so much so it prompted strong words from the Speaker of the House of Commons, who said the Chancellor should be coming to Parliament with these things first. Now, much of what we've heard so far has focused on where the government plans to invest. Today there was an announcement of £5.9 billion for the NHS to help try and clear record backlogs and people waiting for tests and scans. The problem is we're just getting part of the picture, and what the Chancellor will have to do on Wednesday is put these promises in the context of the public finances. We know he's already mindful of what's been spent through the course of the pandemic, so there isn't going to be money all round. The challenge for him is whether he makes the decisions that help the people and the parts of the economy that really need it the most.
Alex, many thanks. Alex Forsyth with the latest there at Westminster. Less than a week before world leaders gather in Glasgow for the Global Climate Conference, the United Nations has warned that greenhouse gases reached record levels last year, despite the economic slowdown caused by the pandemic. A new report suggests that the target set by countries 6 years ago to limit the rise in the Earth's temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius is not being met. Our science editor David Schuckman is here to talk more about this. So just about that initial target, David, way off track?
Way off track. The UN has totted up all the different pledges that different countries have made on climate change and found that they're a long way short, that emissions are still projected to rise by 2030 when the science is screaming that those emissions have to be halved in that time to avoid the most dangerous climate change. So we're still on course for hazardous levels of warming. Now, it's still possible that the world's largest polluter, China, could in the coming days produce some spectacular surprise offer that might change everything. But unless that happens, it's hard to see how the COP26 conference can deliver the kind of real transformation that many want from it.
And when some of the poorer countries say, as they do, that they've not been given the financial help and incentives that they were promised some years ago, do they have a point?
Well, yes, 12 years ago at the Copenhagen summit in 2009, I was there. They were promised that by now they would be getting $100 billion a year to help cope with climate change, which they didn't cause. Today we learned that that target has still not been met, will not in fact be met for another couple of years, greeted with massive disappointment, as you'd imagine. And it might explain why Boris Johnson was saying today that when it comes to the conference and the outcome of it, things are pretty touch and go.
David, we'll talk again during the week. Thanks very much. David Schuckman, our science editor. Let's turn to the pandemic then and the latest official figures, and they show that there were 36,567 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That's a quarter less than last Monday. It means an average of 45,100 new cases were reported per day in the past week. There were 8,239 people in hospital with COVID as of Friday. 38 deaths were reported of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And on average in the past week, 135 related deaths were recorded every day. Mental health services in England have been hit particularly hard by the impact of the pandemic. NHS figures in June show that there were nearly 400,000 new referrals, up nearly a quarter from June 2019. And in East Lancashire, urgent and emergency mental health referrals, the most serious of cases, almost quadrupled in July compared to the same month in 2019. And the picture is similarly stark in other deprived areas, though the figures for England as a whole have remained relatively stable. Our special correspondent, Ed Thomas, has returned to Burnley, where the Lancashire and South Cumbria NHS Trust is under increasing pressure. He's been following the work of local pastor Mick Fleming, who supports some of the area's most vulnerable people. Ed's report does include some distressing detail.
I've really worked hard for you this afternoon.
Inside a closed-down gym in Burnley, now reborn as a church, the desperate seek refuge.
No, he's gone over, hasn't he? Has anybody rung an ambulance? Have we rung an ambulance? Every other person I meet is struggling with one form of mental health or another.
I've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and anxiety.
To come out of a psychiatric unit.
To the street.
To the street.
Whether that's anxiety, paranoia.
Staring at me all the time.
Unable to cope in everyday life.
I feel lost. I want to be human again.
It's not just here in Burnley, it's all over the country. And the people who suffer most are the ones at the bottom of the pile, always.
I don't think I can do it. It's too hard.
Come on. Come with me.
Every week, hundreds climb these steps.
It's all right.
Tonight, the church stays open for John.
Paulie's got mental health issues.
It's so horrible and nasty towards me.
If I lock this door, come and sit down here. Come and sit here. Come on. He dies. Come on, tell me what's happened.
John's paranoid.
Come on, I want you to take a deep breath.
He needs urgent care.
Take a deep breath. Take a really deep breath. All right.
I'm panicking.
So tell me what the big panic is. What's the big one?
Because I'm sick of this happening. We're across the road.
All right, OK. Come on.
I've just had enough. It's been going on too long.
Before this, John said he rang his GP for a prescription, but was told to call back in 48 hours.
Nobody else has listened. He's the only one that ever actually does sit down.
It's all right, John.
I know, but I'm a dirty mess.
John says he's not seen a GP all year.
You don't know what to think, what to do, who to speak to. People look at you like you belong in a little lunatic asylum when you speak about your mental health. It's like, when they don't realise there's thousands suffering.
We're at Church on Street, we've just had a telephone call.
I just don't want to live anymore.
Yeah, we just took an overdose.
Well, you do know we have to ring an ambulance, don't you?
This evening, Pastor Mick received 3 calls in an hour from people at risk of suicide.
Well, she's only just took them.
But he can't answer every call.
I didn't answer the phone, and I got the message that if you don't answer the phone, I'm going to kill myself. And they did.
Help also came too late for Robert.
He was a really kind-hearted person.
He struggled through lockdown. 2 weeks after Joanne asked for support, he took his own life.
The day he killed himself, I had a phone call from the mental health team. Says that, can I speak to Robert Ryan? I was like, well, he's not here no more. They went, what do you mean? I said, I've just found him dead. They said, you're a bit late, ain't you?
And what did they say?
I'm so sorry to hear that. I wish I could have got back sooner. And it feels like it's my fault because I didn't get the help quick enough for him.
And now she can't forget.
You know, I can see the flashbacks in my head all the time. It's like, it's always reminding me of, I can see him every day in my head. When I get up, when I go to sleep. I don't think I can do it. It's too hard.
If Robbie had had early help,
I think he would have been all right. He would have still been here.
what has COVID done to this town, this country?
I think it's made any issues for people that are already struggling 10 times worse. Services are overstretched, overworked. You can't always help everybody.
I can't spell good, I can read okay, but...
During lockdown, Robbie was admitted to a psychiatric unit after trying to end his life.
Is this all you've got in life?
Yeah, just a bit of loose change.
After 6 months, he was released yesterday without accommodation.
Where did you sleep last night?
I was at some old guy's house, didn't have no gas electric, he was smoking gear, so I just ended up going from there, walking around town all night.
He's come out of a psychiatric unit.
To the street.
To the street.
24 hours after being released, Robbie is close to crisis.
Confusion, upset, suicidal. Exactly designed it to make me do it because they don't want me here no more. But I'm just trying to better myself. I just want a better life, that's all I want. I'm sick of this.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. You feel left behind because you can't get any help.
So what do they do?
Well, they turn to addiction a lot of the time.
And that means they're seeing more of this.
No, he's gone over, hasn't he? Can you remember how to do the naltrexone?
And then you give him another one.
Up to 5. He's OD'd him, Ed.
The most vulnerable here, at risk of losing their lives.
He's overdosed him. So people don't like to see that because it's outside our front door and everything, but that's the reality of every city and every town in this country. And I'm sorry if it offends people, but they're dying.
Weeks after being referred, John has been unable to speak to the mental health team.
Well, it's non-existent, my future. I don't really want to live no more because my mental health's that bad.
With Joanne.
Joanne is being supported by Church on the Street. Robbie was placed by Burnley Council in a B&B. Within 72 hours, he was readmitted to a psychiatric unit. Lives changed forever, struggling for mental health care.
It's non-existent in my mind in this country now. Because of where everybody's been treated and all this coronavirus and all the excuses. Because that's all they are, aren't they? Just using excuses.
Some of the voices in that extended report by our correspondent Ed Thomas there. And tonight, NHS England told us that they urge anyone who needs help with mental health issues to come forward. Details of organisations offering information and support are available at bbc.co.uk/action line, or you can call free at any time, and that's to hear recorded information on 08000 155 998. The Metropolitan Police is to apologise to the family of 2 murdered sisters after a report concluded that the level of service provided after their disappearance was unacceptable. Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry were killed in June as they celebrated a birthday in a park in Wembley. The Independent Office for Police Conduct found that officers were slow to investigate after the women were reported missing. More than a third of the world's population are active users of Facebook and its other social media products. It's a startling figure, and the global tech giant has been facing serious allegations about the impact of its platforms on society. A former Facebook manager, who's turned whistleblower, has told a parliamentary committee at Westminster that Facebook and others are subsidising hate online. Our technology correspondent, Rory Catlin-Jones, has the story.
Facebook, a corporate giant used by 2.9 billion people, an empire which includes Instagram, WhatsApp and the virtual reality business Oculus. But now that empire stands accused of putting profits before people.
Francis, we're delighted that you've been able to make this trip to be in London and give evidence to us.
At Westminster this afternoon, Frances Haugen, the whistleblower who's made that charge, told MPs and peers what she'd learned inside the company. She said events like January's storming of the US Congress were made more likely because of the way Facebook was designed.
The algorithms take people who have very mainstream interests and they push them towards extreme interests. You can be someone center-left and you'll get pushed to radical left. You can be center-right, you'll get pushed to radical right. You can be looking for healthy recipes, you'll get pushed to anorexia content.
She described how Instagram facilitated bullying, which would follow children home from school so that it would be with them day and night. And she put much of the blame on Facebook's founder.
You know, Mark Zuckerberg has unilateral control over 3 billion people, right? There's no will at the top to make sure these systems are run in an adequately safe way.
Frances Haugen's testimony comes just as politicians here seem united on the need to rein in Facebook and other online giants. But exactly how a new law would work, well, that's far from clear. The whistleblower told the committee that what was needed from Facebook was complete transparency about its inner workings. Tonight, the social media giant had this response.
I would encourage people to look at what the actual facts are, and hopefully they can see that this is something that this company prioritizes. And let's be honest, it's in our financial interest to make sure that people have a good experience on our site.
Frances Haugen has now taken her allegations about her former employer to politicians in Westminster and Washington. But while Facebook's reputation has certainly been damaged, so far its finances remain very healthy. Rory Kathleen-Jones, BBC News.
A military coup is underway in Sudan, where the armed forces have ended a power-sharing agreement. They've arrested civilian political leaders, including the Prime Minister, and declared a state of emergency. Military and civilian leaders have been at loggerheads since the long-time ruler, Omar al-Bashir, was overthrown some 2 years ago. And protests against the coup have spread from the capital, Khartoum, to several cities. Our Africa correspondent, Anne Soy, sent this report.
Keeping the flames of democracy alive. It is here on the streets of Sudan's cities that they were fanned. And the people are back, trying to stop the military extinguishing them. They shared power with the army, and there was the promise of elections. So the coup is seen as a betrayal.
We reject it completely. We have to go back to the constitutional document. The government should be handed to civilians, and you should free all those you detained and bring them back to their positions.
Thousands heeded the call to defend democracy, and some are paying a heavy price. But many of these images were blocked on state media. They played patriotic songs all day instead, breaking only to bring this announcement by the head of the ruling council.
First, a state of emergency is declared all over the country.
But protesters believed the military's actions today, including putting the Prime Minister under house arrest, speak far louder than their words. Many, including aid agencies working in the country, are concerned about what happens now.
We were about to see full civilian democracy. We're just so concerned. This was a big humanitarian situation before. 14 million people in need of a humanitarian assistance, over 1 million refugees hosted here, and yet this country which is struggling to move on, and it was in some ways. It feels like everything's going back to square one.
It's just 2 years since the streets last looked like this, when longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir was overthrown. It was hoped there would be some stability. But today, that hope seems shattered. Anne Soy, BBC News.
Let's catch up then with the cricket, and the all-rounder Ben Stokes has been added to England's Ashes squad, heading to Australia next month. He's been given the all-clear by his consultant after a second operation on a fractured finger, which he broke in April. He's also taken time out to focus on his mental health. And in the men's T20 Cricket World Cup taking place in the United Arab Emirates, Afghanistan defeated Scotland by 130 runs. Joe Wilson was watching.
There's never been a more significant occasion for Scotland's cricketers. To get here has demanded dedication, inspiration, qualification. They've now earned games against some of the world's highest-ranked nations, and that includes Afghanistan. For Afghanistan's men's team at least, cricket has meant global connection and rapid rise. The future is seriously uncertain. In Sharjah, their batters enjoyed themselves. But there's Mark Watt to spoil the fun. Zazai gone. Scotland are never down for long. Neither, however, was the ball. 11 sixes in Afghanistan's 190. Scotland follow that. Sadly, they couldn't. Tough enough facing Afghanistan's spin bowlers, but then the wicketkeeper holds a catch like this. The match became Afghanistan's occasion. 60 all out. Ouch. Well, that is World Cup cricket. Joe Wilson, BBC News.
And that's it from us now on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.